welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see you all virtually. I'm delighted that you guys could all join us. I'm Elon Berman. I'm the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council. I'm a last minute stand-in for our president, Herman Perchner, who apologizes. He couldn't be here. He had unavoidable conflict. Hopefully I can more or less steer the conversation. Really, Larry's the star of the show, so I'll just get out of his way in a minute. But before I do, I wanted to thank you all for joining us and letting us hear from Larry about his new book, The Kennedys in the World, How Jack, Bobby, and Ted Remade America's Empire. Larry plans to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have what I'm sure is going to be a rich discussion about the book and about sort of how the book relates to current affairs. I'm really looking forward to it. Procedurally, what you all should know is that if you have a question for Larry, and I hope you do, you can put it in the chat box that's at the bottom of the screen. You can just click on the chat function and type in your your question. It'll go to me, and I'll get through as many questions as I can. We're planning to go for about an hour. Larry, I hope it's okay if there's a lot of questions, maybe you'll stay for a couple of extra minutes, but that's what we're planning for. So without further ado, let me introduce Larry, who I am sure most of you know. If you don't, you're in for a real treat. Larry is a senior fellow in U.S. foreign policy here at the American Foreign Policy Council. He is a former senior White House official and an award-winning journalist. He comments frequently in the domestic and international media and writes a column in foreign affairs that appears about twice monthly in various publications ranging from The Hill to The National Interest to Newsweek. He is the author of 6 books, including the book you're going to hear about tonight, The Kennedys in the World. His previous book in 2016 was Harry and Arthur, Truman, Vandenberg, and the Partnership That Created the Free World, which the Wall Street Journal named one of its top 10 nonfiction books of the year. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm really looking forward to hearing about Larry's book. And I hope after that, we'll engage in a very rich back and forth. So before I kick over to Larry, one last plug, because he's not going to do it himself. You may be interested in seeing his piece from the Outlook section of this weekend's Washington Post about the myths that surrounded the Kennedys. It's worthwhile reading, and it's very apropos. So without further ado, let me kick it over to you, Larry, and look forward to hearing about the book.
Okay, very good. I don't know if anyone heard that last plug, but I don't think it's really terribly important. So I know what you were going to say, and it's perfectly fine. You've been generous enough. So anyway, thank you, Alon, for that very kind introduction. Thanks for the American Foreign Policy Council for hosting this, and Alon, Annie Swingen, Rich Harrison, Herman Perchner, and all of my colleagues. And thanks, of course, to all of you for being here. Alon mentioned I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book and about the book itself. I hope we can have a good discussion. I'll just show you very quickly. This is the book. You see the title. The picture is from 1962. So Jack was president, Bobby was attorney general, and Ted was running for the Senate. And they are in deep conversation about something, but I do not know about what. All right, let me begin with a broad observation, which is somewhat obvious. We know a lot about Jack, Bobby, and Ted Kennedy from books, movies, and if we're old enough, like I am, on memories. We know about their successes, their failures, their struggles, and their scandals. We can see their faces and hear their voices and recall their landmark moments. And yet, we continue to learn more about them, just as we learn more about other iconic figures of our past, no matter how many historians have made them the subject of their work. And just as we've seen big new biographies of each of the Kennedy brothers in recent years, we've seen a parade of new books about Lincoln and FDR and our founding fathers. So the search for our history continues, and we always have more to learn. For the Kennedy brothers in particular, the opening of more records, the reflections of more colleagues bring fresh perspectives about them. So from my reading about them, From fresh new records and from my firsthand observations of Ted, I came to discover an untold story about the brothers. Everybody knows that Joe Kennedy, a ruthless and demanding father, and Rose Kennedy, a cold and distant mother, raised their sons for success. As Joe told a friend on the golf course, my work is my boys. Joe and Rose started with their first son, Joe Jr., who died in a dangerous bombing mission over Germany in 1944 at the age of 29. And they continued through Jack, Bobby, and Ted. But there's another angle that has not received much attention. From the time the brothers were little boys, Joe and Rose pushed them not just to succeed, but to look beyond America's borders, to learn about the world, to care about the world, and once they attained power, to shape America's role in the world. And over time, the brothers developed a deep understanding of the world's different peoples and cultures and ideologies, a keen appreciation for the challenges they presented for the United States, and a strong desire to shape America's response to them. Once the brothers assumed power, they each applied what they learned from their education about the world and their travels to put a distinct mark on the American empire. For more than 6 straight decades, one or more of the brothers held public office. Jack was elected to the House in 1946, to the Senate in 52, and to the presidency in 60. Bobby served as a Senate staffer in the 1950s as Attorney General and Jack's closest advisor when Jack was president, and then was elected to the Senate and served there until his murder in 1968. Ted was elected to the Senate in 62 and served all the way until his death in 2009. During their time in office, Jack, Bobby, and Ted shaped broad issues of war and peace, as well as America's response to almost every major global challenge of their times. The Soviet Union and China, the Cold War in Cuba, the Dominican Republic in Chile, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, Korea and Vietnam, South Africa and Northern Ireland, and Iraq twice. And because they shaped the global role of the world's greatest power, they changed the world itself in profound ways. That's the rich, new, fascinating, and consequential story that I tell in this book. The story begins in the earliest days of Jack, Bobby, and Ted. Joe and Rose led discussions about the world with the boys over breakfast and dinner. Joe invited prominent people like Charles Lindbergh and Henry Luce to dine with them and enrich the conversations. Joe wrote to the boys about global events when he or they were away. Joe sent them to travel overseas when they were old enough. Joe arranged meetings for them with the world's leading figures. Joe secured jobs for each of them as foreign correspondents when they were overseas so they could position themselves as global thinkers. All 3 brothers traveled widely, sometimes with one another, but more often with mentors, friends, or colleagues. And when they traveled to learn, not to lie on the beach. They met with kings and czars, prime ministers, and diplomats. They visited war zones and discussed conflicts with military officials. They walked the streets, talked to everyday people, and observed everyday life. And they developed insights into leaders and peoples and cultures and ideologies that they later put to very good use. They were all exceptionally gifted, self-confident writers. Their private notes and articles and other writings were rich in color and insight. So let me give you a few examples. In the summer of 1945, Jack was a 28-year-old journalist with Hearst newspapers. Hearst sent him to Germany to cover the Potsdam Conference, where Truman and Churchill and Stalin would discuss the post-war world. On his way to Potsdam, where he traveled with Navy Secretary James Forrestal, he stopped in Berlin to look at the war damage. In the diary of his trip, he wrote the following: "The devastation is complete. There is not a single building which is not gutted. On some of the streets, the stench, sweet and sickish from dead bodies, is overwhelming. The people all have completely colorless faces, a yellow tinge with pale tan lips. They are all carrying bundles. Where they are going, no one seems to know. I wonder whether they do. They sleep in cellars. The women will do anything for food. 3 years later, in the spring of 1948, Bobby Kennedy was a 22-year-old journalist with the Boston Post. He was on a 6-month trip across Europe and the Middle East, which his father sent him on to learn more about the world. He spent time in what was then known as Palestine, from where he would write four front-page stories for the Post. This was 2 months before the State of Israel was created, but the Jews and Arabs on that land were already headed for war. In the third of his 4 stories, Bobby wrote the following: "The Jews who have been lucky enough to get to Palestine are hardy and tough. They can go into the Mediterranean Sea and get drowned, or they can stay and fight and perhaps get killed. They will fight, and they will fight with unparalleled courage. This is their greatest and last chance. The eyes of the world are upon them, and there can be no turning back." 8 years after that, in the summer of 1956, Ted Kennedy was a 24-year-old journalist with the International News Service. He had wanted to see the world, and when he asked Jack where he should go, Jack suggested Africa, where colonial populations were revolting against their Western rulers and creating new countries. From there, Ted wrote for the International News Service, and in one of his pieces tried to assess the future. He wrote the following: "Changes long pent up are erupting everywhere and moving with incredible speed. An inchoate leadership is still trying to find its footing, and the perspectives of a future foreign policy for Morocco are still wavering and sensitive to foreign negotiations. Finally, the future of Morocco will be determined to a large degree by what happens in the next few months in Algeria and what kind of policy the United States can offer Africa by the start of the new year." Now, everybody knows the basics about the Kennedy family. The brothers grew up in privilege, they were driven to win, and they were challenged to measure up to one another. But what fewer people know is that the Kennedys are what these days we would call dysfunctional, and it affected the brothers in big ways. Joe Kennedy set very high standards for the boys, lashed out at them when they fell short, and pitted one against the other. Not surprisingly, through at least early adulthood, each brother battled deep insecurities about winning his respect. Joe urged his sons to stick together, as he put it, and they did when they were adults. But when they were children, relations between them were often rocky. Joe Jr. felt threatened by Jack, and he bullied and beat him regularly and badly. Jack told a psychiatrist that he agonized about measuring up to his older brother, who was considered the shining star of the family. And Jack, who was carefree and fun, did not much enjoy the company of Bobby, who was dark and dour. After growing up in the same house, raised by the same mother and father, they shared certain traits as adults. They were fierce whenever they competed, tireless in whatever they pursued, demanding on those around them, brave to the point of recklessness, and presumptuous to the point of audacity. But they were not carbon copies of one another. Their personalities and their outlook on America's role in the world were shaped by a host of factors. Jack, who was born on May 29th, 1917, in the family home in Brookline, Massachusetts, was a man of charm and wit, depth and insight, energy and action. He was fun-loving, irreverent, and mischievous. He had a restless mind and a captivating personality, which made him the center of every conversation he was in. When he was not having a stimulating conversation, he was inventing brain-teasing games just for fun. He was often bemused, he mocked himself as much as others, and he had a sharp eye for irony. Because he was so inquisitive and his interests ranged so widely, life with him was never boring. A friend said that his personality was sparkling, and that the time you spent with him seemed like you were at a fair. Interestingly, his sparkling personality emerged from some very difficult circumstances. For one thing, Jack was bitter about the way his mother raised him. As a young boy, he cried when she went on one of her frequent trips, including trips to Europe to shop for clothes. She never visited him during his 5 teenage years at Choate, the private boarding school, even though it was only 65 miles away from home, and even when he spent weeks in the infirmary during his many illnesses. As an adult, he told a friend that his mother, as he put it, never hugged me. Never, never. For another thing, as I've mentioned, Joe Jr. bullied and beat him. Joe Jr. used to crash his bicycle into Jack's, and he once sent him to the hospital for 28 stitches. He smashed footballs in his stomach, and at night he picked fights with Jack that left the two of them throwing each other against the walls of their house. And for still another thing, Jack had a wreck of a body. He had scarlet fever when he was 2, and Addison's disease and serious back problems throughout his life that left him in constant pain. As a House member, he leaned on his colleagues as he walked from his office to the House chamber. As a senator, he sometimes spent the entire day in the Senate chamber to avoid the walking back and forth to his office, and his staff canceled his meetings and brought him his paperwork. And as a House member, senator, and president, he often used crutches that he hid from the public. For Jack, life was a daily struggle, a constant chore, and all of those struggles shaped his outlook on foreign affairs. He was the quintessential Cold Warrior, and he fully embraced the Cold War consensus of his time that America's top global challenge must be to contain Soviet communism. But beyond that, he seemed to project his own struggles onto his country. For him, the question was whether, to gain public office, he could find the strength with an aching back and an ailing stomach to walk streets, climb stairs, shake hands, and deliver speeches from early in the morning until late at night. For his country, similarly, the question was whether it could find the strength, the will, the fortitude to protect itself and to confront its aggressive adversaries. To Jack, whether the year was 1947 or 1963, the challenge was in Europe or Asia, or the issue was military or diplomatic, the nation was always, as he put it, at a moment of maximum peril, facing great danger, confronting our most critical challenge. He warned that time is running out, that we were confronting a peril more deadly than any wartime danger we have ever known. He fretted over the tide of events that were always moving toward the Soviets, the coming communist onslaught, the major disaster that was just around the corner, the seemingly hopeless predicament, the sense of paralysis, waning of hope, sense of drift, gnawing dissatisfaction that was afflicting us, and the threats to the peace and security of the world, if not the continued existence of mankind. Bobby Kennedy was 8 years younger than Jack, and he had his own demons to confront. Bobby, who was born on November 20th, 1925, in Brookline, Massachusetts, was a classic middle child. He was starved for attention as his father poured his hopes into Joe Jr. and Jack, and the family doted on the younger Ted. His father labeled him a runt, and he often seemed like one, especially when standing beside his taller, smoother, older, more handsome brothers. Jack called him Black Robert because he often looked dour and sad. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his head buried in his neck. When Bobby was 20, one of Jack's friends said of him, words came out of his mouth as if each one spoken depleted an already severely limited supply. Even when Bobby was an accomplished adult, his hands sometimes shook when he gave an important speech. As an adult, he once told a friend, sometimes I wish I never was born. To prove himself, he pursued reckless challenges throughout his life. When he was just 3, he jumped into Nantucket Sound while he was sailing with his siblings, even though he didn't know how to swim, and Joe Jr. had to rescue him. At Harvard, he played football on a broken leg against Yale so he could earn his school letter. And as an adult, he swam in dangerous waters, skied dangerous slopes, and climbed dangerous mountains. Overseas, he He waded into hostile crowds even when his security details couldn't guarantee his safety, and he was sometimes spat on and hit by eggs and tomatoes. He inspected dangerous mines to survey working conditions. He praised bravery and courage and guts, and he harshly criticized others for their cowardice. So, not surprisingly, he brought an aggressive, sometimes reckless approach to foreign policy when Jack was president. He also brought a strong sense of morality to it. That's because, like his mother, Bobby was a deeply devout Catholic. He was an altar boy, he regularly attended Mass, and he married Ethel Skakel, who was even more devout than he was. Unlike Jack, who was cool and cerebral, Bobby was passionate. And also unlike Jack, who accepted the world's imperfections and developed his policies accordingly, Bobby viewed foreign policy like he viewed everything else, in terms of black and white, pure, good and evil. And when he changed his mind, he was just as passionate about his new views as he had been about his older ones. Ted Kennedy also was passionate, but he was far less a man swept by passion than Bobby. Ted also was smart, but he was far less of a deep thinker than Jack. But among the three brothers, he was by far the best politician. Ted, who was born on February 22nd, 1932, in Boston, was cute and chubby as a child. He was often lonely as he was shuffled among 10 different schools. When he came home for a weekend, the house was often largely empty, with his father away for work, his mother on one of her trips, Joe and Jack at Harvard or at war, and his other siblings at different boarding schools. His parents and siblings often talked about his weight, which must have proved painful. His siblings called him biscuits and muffins and fat stuff, and in letters among family members when Ted was 8, they called him fat and fatter than ever. But he must have received enough love from his parents because, unlike Jack, he did not harbor any resentments. Even though he was the baby of the family, he needed to earn his stripes, just like his older brothers. When he was 6, Joe Jr. threw him into Nantucket Sound when he didn't carry out a sailing command. When he was 7, his siblings pressured him into jumping off a rock on the Riviera that was at least 20 feet above the water. When he was 28, listen to this. When he was 28 and campaigning for Jack in the West, when Jack ran for president, he ski jumped from 180 feet, even though he had never done anything like it before. And he rode a tough bronco at a rodeo before the horse threw him to the ground. As a child, Ted was rooted and self-confident, and as he moved from school to school, he learned how to make friends quickly. In those early years, he spent lots of time with his maternal grandfather, Rose's father, the former Boston mayor known as Honey Fitz. They'd meet in his office in Boston, or have lunch in the dining room of his hotel, or walk the streets of the city. And Ted watched as Honey Fitz shook hands, traded stories, and offered condolences. So when Ted became a senator at just 30, the minimum age, he already knew how to stroke egos and slap backs and trade favors. That was everything that Jack and Bobby hated to do as senators. Ted viewed the Senate not necessarily the way Jack and Bobby did, as just a step on the ladder to higher office, but as a great place to do fulfilling work over the long term. He deferred to his political elders, and he learned the Senate's Byzantine rules so he could turn ideas into laws. And through his 46 years in the Senate, he had a greater impact on remaking America's empire than either Jack or Bobby. So, how did the brothers remake America's empire? For starters, as they grew from boys to men, all three brothers discarded the isolationism that their father stubbornly promoted throughout his life. From their travels abroad, the travels that, ironically, their isolationist father sent them on, they came to believe that America must play a prominent role on the world stage and that it could serve as a beacon for other countries to emulate. The brothers all feared war, favored diplomacy, promoted human rights, and worked to control the world's deadliest weapons. Through Jack's death in 1963, they were all Cold Warriors. But with what he learned from his travels and his voracious reading, Jack pushed America's Cold War policy in a starkly new direction. He believed that the Cold War would be won not in Europe, but in the developing world, where hundreds of millions of people were deciding between democracy and loyalty to the United States, or communism and loyalty to the Soviet Union. Rather than support right-wing dictators and colonial governments, he wanted America to build relations with grassroots populations because he thought that was a better way to compete with the Soviets and the Chinese over the long term. As a senator, he ruffled feathers in Washington and in Europe by urging the Europeans to free their colonies. As president, he created the Alliance for Progress for Latin America and the Peace Corps for the world. He showered more foreign aid on the emerging nations of Africa, and he met with their leaders. Jack's desire to improve America's image across the developing world also drove his support for the civil rights movement, because America's race problems were making nations of color hesitant to develop strong ties to the United States. After learning valuable lessons from the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he peacefully resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis, secured a limited test ban treaty with Soviets, and laid the groundwork for more arms control, which he had hoped to pursue. He came to doubt his early decision to make a stand against communism in Vietnam, and he sent strong signals that he would withdraw after he won re-election in 1964. Shortly before his death, he was also rethinking his hardline policies toward China and Cuba. Up until then, Bobby and Ted also were hardcore Cold Warriors. In the 50s, Bobby worked on foreign policy for the notorious Senator Joe McCarthy, who, by the way, was a close family friend. He traveled across the Soviet Union with Supreme Court Justice William Douglas, another family friend, and returned to criticize Moscow in speeches and interviews and writings over its human rights abuses and economic backwardness. Also in the 50s, Ted toured Europe with a friend and traveled across Africa with one of his Harvard instructors. In the early 60s, he returned to Africa and then traveled across Latin America and Europe before winning his Senate seat in 1962 as a Cold War hawk. But after Jack died, Lyndon Johnson took over and the world changed. Bobby and Ted changed with it. They evolved from Cold War hawks into leading liberal doves and drove America's foreign policy in starkly new directions. Bobby, in particular, emerged from months of trauma after Jack's death as very much a new man. While Jack became a more seasoned leader over the years, Bobby became more of a revolutionary as he traveled the world and saw the terrible conditions in which people lived and worked. Bobby changed not just because Jack was gone and he could be himself, but because the world changed. The more that Vietnam, which began as a Cold War venture for Jack, turned into a horror show, the more that Bobby questioned the venture, its relationship to the Cold War, and his earlier support for it. He was no less a critic of communism, but he now viewed Vietnam as a much bigger problem for America than the Cold War. He had been a Cold Warrior, but after Jack died, he played a larger role than anyone else in destroying the Cold War consensus. And that left the world more unsettled, and it left America more divided over its global role. Now, like Bobby, Ted also had been a Cold Warrior, and like Bobby, he broke with LBJ over Vietnam. Both Bobby and Ted pushed for more arms control, promoted human rights across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and set the stage for the opening to China that Nixon and Carter later pursued. But unlike Bobby, Ted knew how to get things done in Congress. To an uncommon degree, he knew how to work the system, build coalitions, and achieve results on foreign policy. And that was true even when he was opposed by the president, who is always the country's most powerful figure on foreign affairs. He spearheaded the successful efforts to impose sanctions on South Africa over apartheid, to end proxy wars with the Soviets in Latin America, and to make peace in Northern Ireland. And in his low-key, behind-the-scenes efforts that haven't received nearly the attention they deserve, he convinced Soviet and Chinese leaders to free dozens and dozens of political prisoners. As I said earlier, he had a greater long-term impact on remaking America's empire than either Jack or Bobby. And with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you for listening. I look forward to the questions. I hope that I have enticed at least some of you to take a close look at this. And if I haven't yet, maybe we will do so during the Q&A. So in any case, thanks very much for listening. Alon, back to you.
Sure. Larry, thank you for that. That's quite a tour de force in terms of their history. By the way, incidentally, just as a personal anecdote, I lived for a couple of years a block from Jack's birthplace in Brookline. So I know it well. Let me kick this off and let me ask the first question. But before I do, let me remind the audience members that if you have a question, I see there's at least one hand up virtually. Put your questions in the chat function, and I'll read through them and we'll process them in turn. Okay, so let me ask you this. I was sort of struck by the amount of in-depth research that you did with regard to their childhood, their formative experiences, and sort of how it shaped their worldview. But in your research, and you know, it's a thick book, you did a lot of research. What impressed you most about the brothers, and in terms of how they thought about the world?
Well, a series of things. First of all, I think it was no small thing to, you know, break with an overbearing father and decide to discard isolationism and move in a completely different direction. You know, their views were, you know, debated in the House and actually even in public. I mean, you know, Joe Kennedy had public spats with Jack over, you know, the right approach to Europe and Asia. So the independence that they developed from an overbearing father was one thing. Their extraordinary desire and capacity to learn. When you read their stuff, the diaries, the dispatches back home, the private notes, the long magazine pieces that they wrote over time in the New York Times Book Review, popular magazines of the time like Look and McCall's, deep in detail about peoples and cultures and ideologies and history. And I'd say finally, the seriousness with which they approached things. Now, of course, I don't want to put them on a pedestal, and they were hardcore politicians, and they were not naive about, you know, what you needed to do to get elected and all of that stuff. They played politics hard, all three of them. But when it came down to deciding what to do, I think they were just strikingly serious and deep and sincere about wanting to do the right thing for the country on foreign policy. They took the country's challenges very seriously and really thought them through and were willing to stand alone, which each of them did at different times. You know, Jack, in terms of, you know, his willingness to go head to head with Eisenhower and the Europeans over policy in Africa. Bobby, obviously going head to head with JFK, with LBJ, but not just over Vietnam. I mean, over Latin America, where LBJ discarded the Alliance for Progress and wanted to cozy up to right-wing dictators again. And, you know, Ted spearheaded the congressional override of Reagan's veto of sanctions against South Africa. He was a member of the Senate minority at the time, and it was the first override of a president on foreign policy in 11 years. So these guys were willing to put it on the line, stand alone, take on powerful people if they believed it was important enough. So combination of all of that, I think, Alon.
Well, that's great. And I was actually, so the questions are sort of pouring in. So, and very much along the lines of sort of where you started about the formative education and the upbringing and the curiosity and sort of the intellectual milieu that they began in. I'm interested in, and sort of to echo one of the questions that's in the chat, I'm interested in the influence, both positive and negative, that Joe Sr. had over the development of the boys, over sort of how they saw the world, and sort of how it shaped their political views. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, first of all, in terms of focusing them abroad, they spent, even though there was a lot of travel, obviously, by Joe and Rose at different times, they spent a lot of time together as a family. And if you were not willing to engage in robust conversation of whatever the topic of the night happened to be, you were kind of left out. Their house was a hotbed of intellectualism, and the conversation was spirited. And at one point, Ted Kennedy wrote in his later years, one way to participate in the conversation was to either have an interesting experience or read an interesting book or take a trip. And that household was, day to day, constant intellectual battle. And Joe kind of led it, and he challenged them. I mean, he didn't just talk, he put them on the spot. What do you think, Jack? What do you think, Bobby? The sisters, by the way, were there. They were part of it, but the focus was clearly on the boys. And after all, at that time, society was much different, and he assumed, perhaps rightly, that if anyone was going to attain power, it was going to be the men in the family. Beyond that, in terms of how they developed their worldview, it was from not just being in their house. It was the fact that Joe insisted that they travel, even though they came back with different views than Joe himself had. I mean, Jack talked to people on the ground, as did Bobby, as did Ted. So he went to Potsdam, I already mentioned that. He went to Europe in 48. In 1951, he went to Europe for 5 weeks, and then later in the year, he went with Bobby across Asia and the Middle East for 7 weeks. And he talked to people at the top and people on the street, and he really got to know the place. That's no different than when Bobby went, to Europe and the Middle East in 48 for 6 months. Nor is it different than when Ted went to Europe and then Africa from 1950 and then 56 and then 1960 and then to Latin America in 1961. So, Joe may have had a view of the world from an isolationist standpoint, but the boys, from being out in the world and seeing the challenges to America from every corner of the globe, came to a different conclusion, which was that the world's most powerful nation needed to play a role to confront the challenges and make the world a safer and more prosperous place.
Right, and I find that divergence that sort of draw as a result of their travel to sort of to be fascinating. So let me ask you, so was that what drew you to the Kennedys? Why the Kennedys? Why did you pick this family, this dynasty over other dynasties? And what drew you to them?
So I had long had a fascination with and an appreciation for Jack and his extraordinary depth. If you read his speeches from the 1950s, I mean, they are works of extraordinary depth and poetry, almost always focused on foreign affairs, where really his intellectual bent was. But, you know, I had this knowledge of Jack and somewhat of a knowledge of Bobby. And then I'm watching Ted here in Washington, you know, as a journalist and in other capacities. And I'm thinking about the way Jack approached foreign affairs. And I'm watching Ted, and as he's confronting Reagan, who is trying to, in essence, resurrect the Cold War consensus. In the 1980s, the Cold War consensus that all three brothers shared in the 40s and 50s up through the early 60s. So I started kind of poking around a little bit about Ted as compared to Jack. And I learned a lot about Ted. And the more I read, I learned more and more about Jack. And I thought that this was kind of an interesting story to tell, an untold story to tell about the brothers and their extraordinary influence and how it evolved over the course of more than 6 decades over foreign policy. But through that lens, to tell the larger story of America's role in the world in the post-war period. Now, you mentioned one of my books, my previous book, Harry and Arthur, which was about how Truman and Vandenberg created the architecture of the free world in the 1940s. I, in essence, wanted to go from that to tell the broader story of America's post-war role through the course of decades. And I discovered that, you know, with the Kennedys and telling this untold story about the brothers, I could also tell this larger story about America's global role over the course of decades through the lens of Jack, Bobby, and Ted. So that's how it came about.
No, that's fascinating. So let me go back to something that you talked about just a couple of minutes ago, in terms of the early life of the early adult life of the boys and sort of their upbringing, and it's fascinating how much they learned from that experience by going abroad and sort of learning from other cultures. It's also fascinating because it's something that doesn't happen nearly as often these days.
Right.
And how do we replicate that kind of learning among current politicians, right? Who are either averse to it or not exposed to it, but there seems to be a teachable moment here.
Yes, one would hope. I will say that the amount of travel that they did was particularly unusual. But I also can tell you from my readings of those earlier decades, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, members of Congress traveled more. And they traveled more like in a serious way. Big delegations going to faraway places to look at the challenges, you know, up close. And yes, we can make fun of the fact that they're going on junkets and all the rest. But my impression is that while they have certain um, uh, benefits, of course, in terms of their travel, my impression is they're actually, when they go, they actually work kind of hard. And they actually do serious stuff and they meet with serious people, and it's really important. We have in recent years kind of fallen into a little bit more of you know, acceptable isolationism. Like, I don't need to go abroad, you know, America first. I'm not trying to be political here, okay? I'm just trying to tell a larger story, because it does, by the way, it does predate Trump. The reluctance of members, you know, to go abroad has been greater in recent years, but not just the last 4 years. And yes, I would hope that people would read this and come to appreciate that if you want to understand the world, you need to go see it. It's not enough to listen to testimony. Testimony is important, but it's not enough. And certainly the brothers learned a lot, particularly Ted, who held lots of hearings and heard a lot from, you know, refugees and political dissidents and all the rest, and filled out his knowledge and shaped his pursuits. But boy, there's nothing like spending time with people, whether leaders or people on the ground, in their home place, as opposed to when they come visit us and they're on our turf. It's different, and the more that members go, the better perspective they will have on the challenges that are out there that we need to confront.
Right. All right. So let me stick with that train of thought for just one second, because there's a lot of parallels between the very fraught international and domestic environment that the Kennedy brothers experienced when
Right.
they were coming of age and when coming of political age, and the challenges that we face now. And I'm curious, from your position as a historian, sort of looking at their lives, what are the lessons from their lives that are applicable to this moment where we have a polarized society, sort of a very fraught international environment. What are the lessons that they can impart to us?
So this is kind of interesting. I mentioned before the Cold War consensus. So the aftermath of World War II, at least through, up through Vietnam, and then at different times, really, even from that period until the Soviet demise in around 1990, there was a broad view that if the Soviets are always our most important challenge, they were a major challenge that we could never lose sight of. And why? Because we were promoting a certain view of governance, freedom, and democracy. And the Soviets, who were controlling vast stretches of the world, were promoting an alternative view of governance. That is no different than what's going on right now, in particular with Beijing. It's not the only place. I mean, China's not the only country that's doing this. Obviously, Russia is as well as Iran and Turkey. But basically, freedom and democracy, once again, is competing with authoritarianism. It's not the same version as we have with Soviet communism, but it is still state-controlled societies, much different than the freedom that we enjoy and that we promote abroad. And we need to, as we competed with the Soviets in all different forms, not just military and diplomatic, but in terms of something you know a lot about, public diplomacy, and all the means of communication. I get the sense that while there was great concern, and Jack had great concern in particular in the 50s, that we were not competing as robustly as we should, I think there's reason to feel the same way now about rising autocracy. Freedom House just reported, I believe, that we just suffered the 15th straight year of decline of freedom around the world. 15 straight years. That's the longest period of recent global history. And this is serious stuff. I mean, freedom, civil liberties, political rights are shrinking around the world. And we know from experience that a freer, more prosperous world is a freer, more democratic world, I should say, is a safer, more prosperous world, not just for the world, but for us. So to the extent that there was concern about whether we were competing adequately with the Soviets, I think there's concern now that we're not competing adequately with China in particular. So I think that's the clearest parallel that I see.
No, that's great. And frankly, all of that rebounds to the domestic sphere as well, right? Because sort of the way America looks and the way America sort of
Right.
behaves internally has a profound impact over the image that it projects to the world. So talk for a minute or two about how the brothers, how their travel experience, but also sort of their formative views about civil rights, how it sort of shaped how they governed, shaped, sort of how they thought about America and America's place in the world.
Well, so civil rights is endlessly fascinating, I must tell you. Jack did not grow up, Jack in particular, the three boys, did not grow up as someone who agonized about the treatment of African Americans because it wasn't his experience. He grew up in privilege. And to the extent he was shaped, he was not shaped by the Great Depression or by civil rights. He was shaped by the Cold War. He went to war. So he was, and obviously became a hero through the PT 109. But I mean, he understood war, and he was involved in battle and saw people shot and saw people die, and it shaped his worldview. So civil rights did not come naturally to him. It didn't come naturally to Bobby either, but it came more sincerely to Bobby as they both grappled with it. But the thing that they had in common was that they felt very strongly that civil rights was just really hurting the United States at a very critical time. We were having Here's a good example. So the freedom rides in the South. People were going down south and trying to make sure that the South was enforcing, freedom on public buses and public facilities and all the rest. And they're going down on these buses. They're going into the deep South, and they're getting the hell beat out of them by white mobs. Stories are coming out, and the Soviets are exploiting this all over the world through their own organs and through, the countries that they have great influence over. Well, this is happening in April, and Jack and Bobby are heartsick. Why? Because Jack is meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna in June, 2 months later. And Jack even says to his civil rights advisor, Harris Wofford, can't you get your damn friends off the buses? Now, that doesn't come from a moment of sincere pain over what's happening from a civil rights standpoint. It's from a foreign policy standpoint. And in fact, when he finally gets around to proposing his civil rights legislation in 1963, and it comes before the Senate Commerce Committee, who does Jack send as his first witness? Not a domestic policy advisor, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, to talk about the international implications. So this is, people don't realize that, and this was true really of Truman and Eisenhower before Jack, but not as much as it was true of Jack, that civil rights was an extraordinary foreign policy challenge for the United States at the height of the Cold War.
All right, a couple more questions, and then I'm going to end with one of my own. So there's that old saying that strategy never survives first contact with the enemy. And so in that context, right, you write about the fact that JFK sort of had a complicated relationship with Vietnam, right? And he sort of had anti-war sentiments before, but then when he was elected, he voted to increase the military presence. Can you talk about that a little bit, about how the thinking shifted?
So Vietnam is probably the best example of the competing strains of Jack's foreign policy. And I think every thoughtful president has competing strains because the world is a complicated place. But keep in mind, Jack wanted, particularly in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, to prove to Khrushchev that he wasn't weak and that he wasn't stupid, both of which Jack feared. So after the Bay of Pigs, Jack said, after deciding that we're not going to get into Laos, as his military advisors were suggesting at the time, he said to his advisors, we're going to make a stand against communism in Vietnam. So half of Jack wants to, make a stand against communism and prove to Khrushchev that the United States is not going to be pushed around when it comes to the world. Okay, that's fine. What's the other half of Jack's view? Well, a big U.S. military presence in the developing world is going to cause resentment and going to turn off the very people that, as I described before, he wants to build new relationships with, right? The hundreds of millions of people who don't want a colonial presence. They want a partnership with the United States. They want foreign aid. They want economic assistance. They want technical assistance. So through his entire White House tenure, he struggled with both elements of the Vietnam dilemma. Make a stand against communism, but don't have a big military presence in the developing world. By the end of '63, before his death, I am convinced that the don't have a big presence side of him had won. And he told McNamara, Secretary of Defense Bob McNamara, to plan for withdrawal. He reduced the number of military advisors before his death from 18,000 to 16,000 as the first step of a withdrawal. He told Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield that he was going to withdraw after the election in 64. And he told a whole variety of White House people that he was going to withdraw. The reason he did not withdraw earlier is because he feared a who lost Vietnam fiasco, similar to the who lost China controversy that erupted after Mao took over mainland China in 1949, and it came back to haunt Truman and the Democrats. If not for that, he would have withdrawn earlier. So people can draw their own conclusion about whether that was savvy or politically weak and all the rest. But it's at least a politically reasonable calculation.
Right. Okay. So let me turn a little bit to current affairs. So you and I both spend a lot of time these days writing about the Middle East in general, and things like Iran and Israel in particular. I want to talk about how that connects a little bit with the Kennedys, and how do the Kennedys think about Israel? How do they think about the Middle East? Sort of, what did they see it as a burden, or as a sort of an area of promise? How did they think about it strategically?
So it's interesting. So they are three products, I must tell you, because I think it's relevant, of somebody who became more anti-Semitic over time. The more Joe Kennedy became frustrated with FDR, on the one hand, because he didn't think that he was getting the jobs he deserved for campaigning for FDR. On the other hand, because he didn't think that FDR was treating him very well when he was the US ambassador in London, and Roosevelt was talking directly to Churchill and not going through him, the more he was blaming it on FDR's Jewish advisors. Jack and Bobby mouthed a little bit of Joe's anti-Semitism in their early years, but they quickly discarded it. And all three brothers became fans of Israel. And I read you before some of the writings of Bobby and his support of the Jews and their struggle there. And Ted, of course, played an enormous role in behind the scenes in convincing the Kremlin to free Jewish refuseniks. So they had a great appreciation for the Jewish people. They had a great appreciation for Israel as a democracy. Having said that, they all three of them understood, competing interests in the Middle East. It was and is the only democracy. And you've got to cooperate with some unsavory powers. Now, it was even worse back then when we were far more dependent on energy sources from that part of the world. But look, they navigated it as best they could, understanding that we wanted to certainly stand by our free and democratic ally, but at the same time, it's balance of power politics. And they did the best they could in terms of navigating the other interests in the region. That's about the best I can do for you. It's complicated, I need not tell you.
That it is. All right, so final question, because we're right at the 8 o'clock mark. You've been enormously generous with your time. I think this is a good sort of capstone to everything we talked about tonight. What do you see as the legacy of each of the brothers, right? I mean, they had different impacts, sort of worked in different fields, but very much synergistic in terms of how they shaped the world, and how their worldview was affected by one another. So what do you see as sort of the lasting legacy of the Kennedy brothers?
Well, certainly for all three of them, great sensitivity to parts of the world that we often don't spend enough time thinking about. The developing, what we used to call the third world, what we now call the developing world, and the struggles, and how those parts of, and how the world is increasingly interconnected, and how what happens in Africa and Asia and Latin America affects us more and more. So I think they were somewhat visionary when it came to very much ahead of their time in terms of understanding the developing world at a time when US foreign policy was largely Eurocentric. So that's number one. Number two, part of what I said before, the seriousness in which they approached foreign policy, the depth in which they wanted to understand issues, people's ideologies, cultures, and how that relate to us. And then, of course, they have individual legacies. I mean, Jack reshaped Cold War policy. I'll do this kind of at a superficial level here because we're talking about individually all three of them. I mean, if you think of Jack, you think about a visionary approach to fighting the Cold War through the developing world, and the great way that he learned from his mistakes. He really learned from the Bay of Pigs. And if every president learned from his mistakes the way Jack learned from his mistakes, our country would be a better place. So that's number one. Bobby, look, his legacy is going to be, him, in essence, emerging as a different person, and basically confronting the Cold War consensus, and through his opposition to Vietnam, probably leaving the country a little bit more unsettled than it had been, but for a greater purpose that he, believed fervently in, and that and human rights, I think, and his travels around the world. Ted, look, you have to start with Ted with not just the legacy of Jack and Bobby that he tried to build on with regard to human rights and arms control, and building alliances with people on the ground in all different parts of the world, and promoting freedom and democracy. But unlike Jack and Bobby, you just have to put very high up his ability to govern. I mean, he was just head and shoulders above Jack and Bobby when it came to knowing how to get things done. And it is his influence over foreign policy over the course of decades and reshaping America's global role really is the untold story within the untold story of this book. Okay? The untold story at one level is Jack, Bobby, and Ted, the great kind of drama of their lives in reshaping America's role in the world. But the great untold story within that is Ted, who everyone thinks of as the liberal lion. Healthcare, civil rights, workers' rights, education, and almost nobody associates with foreign affairs. When Barack Obama eulogized Ted Kennedy, he did not say a single word of foreign policy. When Senate Majority Leader at the time, Harry Reid, eulogized Ted Kennedy, did not say a single word about foreign affairs. And foreign affairs was equal to domestic issues when it came to his extraordinary influence over the course of about 46 years in the Senate.
All right. I think we're going to have to leave that there. Larry is far too humble to say so, but I will say so. I think everybody should buy the book. I think everybody should buy Kennedy's in the World. Larry, thank you so much for doing this work, for sharing your insights with us. I want to thank everybody who attended the live Zoom, watched on Facebook. This is going to be available on AFPC's YouTube channel. So if you missed the live broadcast, I hope you'll tune in at a later date. Larry, thank you again for everything.
Well, thank everybody who tuned in, and thanks AFPC for hosting. And yes, what can I say? Buy the book, The Kennedys in the World.
Well, and we'll have that be the last word. Thank you, everybody. Good night.